All right, I'm going to weave in some ends now. This is the bottom of the hat that I just seamed up, and I seamed it using this bright pink yarn. So I'm going to demonstrate with this pink yarn first how to weave in the ends. At the bottom of your hat, there's an opportunity to kind of fix any offsetness, if I can use that as a word, that there might be in the bottom of your hat. I'm going to use that purple yarn to do that. So for this pink one, I'm just going to reinforce it by pulling it back in the direction that it came from. I'm going to turn my hat inside out, and I'm going to do some really simple weaving in here. I have a seam along the inside of my hat, so I'm just going to weave this tail in along the inside of the seam. When I do that, I'm just going back and forth, pulling the wool needle away from me and then towards me to snake my tail along the edge of the seam. By snaking it, by moving it back and forth like a snake, you create resistance so that it won't come undone if it gets pulled on in this direction. The other thing you can do to secure a tail when you're weaving it in is to take the tail and split the yarn that you're pulling it through. That it just holds on to it a bit tighter than it would if you go underneath the yarn. That's underneath and this is through, and you'll feel it with your wool needle. It'll create a little more resistance as you pull it through. All right, so that's weaving in an end up the side of a seam. Now I'm going to go back to this one here, and I'm going to weave it in, but I'm also going to make the edge look a little neater. The way that I do that is to create a loop that joins the end where this tail is coming from to the beginning part of my ribbing. So I'm going to create a loop that looks like this. What I do is I just take my tail and I go through 2 bars, or the edge of my hat here. I go through the two stitches on the edge, pull that through, and then go back into the stitch close to near. I cannot go into the same stitch, or maybe I'm just going to go close to it here and pull that so that I have what looks like another knit loop joining both ends of my ribbing together. If I don't feel like I've lost the divot or that little edge that's there, I can pull it out, and I can try going just a little bit further in. So this time, instead of going through these 2 stitches or this edge stitch here, I'm going to go through this one and just see if it looks better to me than my first option. Yeah, I think that looks better when I pull it tight. Okay, so that just creates a smoother edge on my hat. And then I go to the inside. Now I wove the pink yarn up this side, so I don't want to weave my purple yarn up the same side. I'm going to move over a little bit. And this time, I could weave up this side of the seam, but let's just pretend there's no seam this time, and I'll show you what I do here. So on this bit of ribbing that I've got here, I'm just going to go back and forth through the knit stitches, up 1 row each time, again still snaking the yarn back and forth to keep it secure in there. When I get up to the stockinette stitch section, or if I started with stockinette stitch, I would do the same thing, except that I would go horizontally, pulling the yarn through the purl bumps back and forth along the purl side of my stockinette stitch. And you can see that that's barely noticeable, so that's good. And that back and forth movement means that my yarn won't pull out. When I go to cut my yarn, I always leave about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch of a tail sticking up. In this case, because I'm using a chunky yarn, I'm going to leave a bit of a bigger tail, because when you wash, wear, or block this hat, you see how that tail sucks in a little bit? So I always leave enough of a tail sticking there that with wear, it doesn't pop through to the right side of your work. Let's go back to this tail for a second. I want to show you another little trick. Imagine that this was a reversible hat, or maybe it was a scarf, and you wanted to be able to weave in your ends so that they wouldn't be seen on either side. If you have a plied yarn like I do, one trick is to unply the yarns. So I've split the plies in half, and now I'll split them again. Since this yarn has 4 plies, I can have 4 individual strands of yarn. Now, this yarn is pink and it's quite bright against my purple background, but watch what happens when I weave in just one of those plies. I'm going to do this one here. So I'm going to weave it in exactly the same way that I did below. I'm going to go under a purl bump and then go under the next purl bump, but in the opposite direction with my wool needle. So away from me, towards me. I like these wool needles with the little nylon loop on top because it makes it very easy to weave in your ends. Away from me, towards me. Okay. So you can still see the pink here a little bit. Imagine what that would look like if you had purple. I mean, it's practically disappearing. I have 4 of these to weave in, so it's going to take me 4 times as long as it would if I just left it with one strand. But I think the results are worth it. So if you were weaving in an end on a scarf and you wanted to be able to look at both sides of the scarf and not see it, this is a good way to do that. When you trim your end, make sure to leave a little bit of yarn sticking out, because again, when you pull on that, it's going to suck in. Okay. So that's a little bit about weaving in your ends in your project and having a nice finished result.